Here we go. One step at a time, don't be living on the line.
What would you do if you showed up to your first day of a new class and you found that there were 16 classmates joining you, but there were only 6 chairs in the room? Your teacher tells you that unfortunately we're going to have to live with the 6 chairs that we have, and for some reason the other 10 chairs have been taken by the school for some other use. So he tells you, you got to work it out. It's up to you guys to decide who gets the chairs and how often to get them. The chairs have suddenly become what we in economics call a scarce resource. You've probably never been in this situation before. Of course, most good schools would make sure that all students had a chair. But in my class, this isn't always the case. Today, my 16 new economics students showed up to find that there were only 6 chairs available to go around. Was this for real, or was this some sort of lesson in economics that they just didn't realize that they were experiencing? Well, it turns out the latter is the case. In fact, the first lesson I always teach in my economics class is that of scarcity. Scarcity is what we in economics know as the basic economic problem. Something is scarce when it is limited in supply and in demand. Not all resources are scarce. For example, air. Air is something that everybody demands. In fact, we all need it to live. However, it is not limited in supply. The amount of air in our atmosphere, at least at the present time, is nearly infinite. It's enough for all humans to breathe and consume the air that they need without infringing on others' consumption of that air. However, this is not the case for all resources that we require. Anytime certain individuals in society demand a good, yet that good is limited in supply, it is known as a scarce resource. So what was the point of today's lesson in my first economics class? Students aren't used to showing up and finding that chairs are scarce. They're used to having enough chairs for everybody to sit down. Chairs in most classes at my school are like air in the atmosphere. Everybody gets what they need without infringing on somebody else's consumption of the necessary good. So what did we do? Students were given the opportunity to determine who got chairs. What they needed to do was determine a system for allocating scarce resources. In other words, they needed to establish an economic system. Scarcity is the basic problem of economics. The very reason we have a social science known as economics is to help society deal with the scarcity of natural and other resources that we depend on for our well-being. Scarcity necessitates choices. What does this mean? It means that when there are competing wants and needs of society, yet a limited amount of resources, choices must be made about how to allocate scarce resources efficiently, and sometimes we might say equitably. The very problem of scarcity gives rise to the need for a system for allocating scarce resources between society's competing wants and needs. So what kind of systems of allocation do we have to choose from? Well, in my class, I left it up to my students to decide how they would allocate our scarce chairs between each other. Let's reflect on some of the systems that they've come up with in the past and talk about what might be considered the most efficient or equitable system based on the observations of economists that have studied problems like this throughout history. Here are some of the systems for allocating the scarce chairs that my students have come up with today and in years past. Some of the more popular ones tend to be systems like first come, first serve. In other words, whoever gets to class first gets access to a chair. Other systems that have been proposed are oldest first. In other words, seniority. A system of seniority determines who gets chairs based on age. Whoever's oldest gets the chairs, and whoever's youngest does not. Other systems that have been proposed are merit. In other words, those who have the highest grades get chairs. Students have also proposed a lottery system. Just put all the names in a hat, and the first 6 names that get drawn get their chairs. Ultimately, most years, somebody comes up with the idea of an auction. In the auction system, students get to bid on chairs, and those who are willing to pay the most for chairs ultimately get to have the chairs. After completing this exercise, I asked my students to reflect on the different systems that they have proposed and choose one, and then we are actually going to do that to determine who gets the chairs. So what would an economist say about the scarce chairs exercise? Economists would recognize that chairs that are scarce, in other words, limited in supply, yet everybody wants one, are symbolic of most of the resources that we must decide how to use in society today. Mineral resources, water resources, other natural resources such as those derived from the forest. Labor resources are also scarce. People themselves are a scarce resource. Skilled labor, low-skilled labor, if they were not scarce, if resources and labor were not scarce, then there wouldn't be a price attached to them. Teachers are scarce, therefore we get paid to teach. Factory workers are scarce, therefore they get paid to work in the factory. Oil is scarce, therefore oil companies get paid when they extract the resource from the earth and sell it to the end users. Scarcity is the basic problem on which the study of economics is based. Economics studies the allocation of society's scarce resources between its competing wants and needs. Economic systems, some of which we have brainstormed in my class, and some of which we didn't even begin to touch on, provide society with the tools to determine who gets what resources and how they are allocated between society's different wants and needs. In the rest of our study of economics, we're basically going to be building on this problem of scarcity. What we'll look at is the different systems that have been developed and implemented over time for allocating scarce resources between society's wants and needs. We'll use different tools, including models, graphs, diagrams, formulas, mathematics, to understand how society's scarce resources can be most efficiently and in some cases equitably or fairly distributed between those in society who need and want them most.
Here we go.